Welcome to Leadership in Conservation, the podcast for people trying to lead meaningful work in organisations that are full of passionate people, tight budgets, and just enough chaos to keep things interesting. I'm Patrick Haywood, and I work with leaders across the conservation and charity sector, helping them to navigate everything from strategy and culture to those slightly awkward conversations we all try to avoid. And honestly, despite the challenges we're going to be talking about on this podcast, I genuinely love this sector because conservation organisations are often filled with thoughtful, values-driven people doing work they truly believe matters. Work that protects species, habitats, communities, landscapes, and sometimes people's mental health and sense of connection. There's purpose in this work. And in a world where a lot of people feel disconnected from meaning, that really matters. But in this first episode, we're going straight in. Why can leadership in conservation be so difficult? Let's start with the obvious. Conservation organisations are full of people who care deeply about wildlife, about nature, ecology, the planet, and often about doing the right thing. Not just efficiently, but ethically, and often that creates genuinely lovely places to work. People support each other, teams are usually collaborative, there's often warmth, humour, humanity, and a sense that the work beyond just profit and targets matters. And honestly, I'd take that over a cold, toxic culture any day of the week. But here's the catch. Care doesn't automatically equal clarity, and passion doesn't automatically equal alignment. In fact, sometimes it creates the opposite. Because when everybody cares deeply, they often care deeply about different things. One person is passionate about species recovery, another about community engagement, another about campaigning, another about education. And then there's another passionate about data and evidence. And suddenly leadership isn't just about direction. It's about bringing people together with strong, multiple beliefs about what right looks like. So let's talk about something slightly uncomfortable. Most conservation organizations say they are mission-led, but in reality, they can often become funding-led. Now, that's not because leaders are cynical or chasing growth for ego, quite the opposite. Most are trying to keep the important work alive in an environment where funding is uncertain, demand is growing, and resources are stretched. And honestly, many organizations achieve extraordinary things with very little, as many of you will know. But funding inevitably shapes behavior. If the funding says, we'll pay for peatland restoration, suddenly peatland becomes a priority. We'll fund community engagement, suddenly engagement ramps up. We want measurable biodiversity outcomes, suddenly everything needs metrics. And over time, what can happen is this. Strategy starts to drift, teams start to chase funding streams, the original purpose can get a bit blurry. I sometimes call this chasing the money cloud. And if you're leading in that environment, your job becomes incredibly difficult because you're constantly trying to answer, what do we actually stand for when funding keeps moving? And that's a big question for many teams. Here's another truth. Conservation and the charity sector more broadly tends to attract good people, kind people, values-driven people, which is a strength. And it can also create a challenge because eventually leadership means needing to say things like, this piece of work isn't good enough. You're not delivering. This isn't aligned to where we're going. And suddenly that supportive, collaborative culture can start to avoid conflict. Not because people are weak, usually because they care about relationships. They don't want to hurt people. They don't want to demotivate people. And often they know their teams are already exhausted. So leaders end up stuck in this strange tension. wanting to be supportive, but needing to be clear, wanting to maintain harmony, but knowing something isn't working. And if that tension isn't handled well, then you can get drift, underperformance, quiet frustration, and eventually burnout at leadership level. Because leaders start carrying problems they should be really addressing. Another pattern I see all the time, you've got passionate teams and each team believes our work is the most important. And honestly, they're often not wrong. That passion is one of the sector's greatest strengths. It creates commitment, creativity, innovation, people willing to go far beyond their job description because they genuinely care about the mission. But collectively, it can create a challenge because leadership then becomes not just setting strategy, but prioritizing between good things. And that's harder than choosing between good and bad. So you get competing priorities, competing teams, resource tension, teams pulling in slightly different directions, and leaders stuck in the middle thinking, how do I align this without crushing people's energy or passion? So if you're sitting in a senior role, CEO, director, head of department, this is often the reality you're dealing with. You're not just managing work, you're navigating ambiguity, what actually matters right now, alignment, getting people pulling in the same direction, and capacity, too much to do, not enough resource. Emotion, because people care deeply about that. And the combination, that's what makes leadership in this space utterly challenging. And it also is what makes it meaningful. Because unlike some sectors, people here usually aren't just turning up for salary. They're turning up because they believe the work matters, and that's worth protecting. There's a simple lens I often use with leadership teams. Most of the challenges I see tend to sit in one of these three areas. Clarity, do we know what matters? Alignment, are we pulling together? And capacity, do we actually have the time and the resource? If something feels messy, it's almost always one or more of those that's missing. So that's the landscape: messy, human, purpose-driven, sometimes chaotic, but also often deeply rewarding. And in the next few episodes, we're going to get practical. We'll look at things like how to set strategy without chasing funding, how to align passionate teams without killing their energy, and how to handle performance issues in nice cultures, and what it really means to lead at CEO level in this sector. So if you're leading in conservation or the wider charity world and you're thinking, yeah, this all sounds painfully familiar, then you're exactly who this episode and podcast is for. And if you're someone who still believes organizations can do meaningful work and lead people well, then hopefully this podcast will help with that too. Next time, we'll tackle one of the biggest challenges of all: how to set clear strategy when the funding keeps pulling you off course. Thank you very much for listening.